Author and historian Jonathan Parshall joined us at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans to discuss his new book, 1942, Crux of War. This conversation between Parshall and Rob Citino was recorded in front of a live audience.
Are these things on?
Look at that. The microphone is on. There's a very
Woodstock
large
question. The Woodstock question. Is this thing on?
Is this on?
I'm really happy to be here with John Curatola. Said that he considers John Parshall a friend, and I do too. And the same thing about the libations, John. It's a theme of all our relationships together. So tonight, your book is being celebrated, The Crux of War. John, the title tells us, I think, what the book is about, 1942. And if I may say, the total page count shows how deeply you researched this and dove into it. But if you don't mind, tell me two things. And first of all, why 1942 as opposed to the other years? The war went on, and some, depending on who you're talking about, 39 to 45, and maybe beyond. What about 1942?
So it came out of writing Shattered Sword, and that book came out in 2005, into 2005. And of course, immediately everyone's like, whoa, what are you doing next? And the answer is, I'm doing whatever my wife wants me to do next. But I did come out of that book. Midway is one of those classic battles where you're talking about turning points and decisive battles, right? Everybody's called that about Midway for years and years, and I've had to live with that now for 20 years, and I have mulled on the nature of decisive battles and turning points. The other thing that I came out of was just this feeling that, okay, I've written this book about a battle that happened in 1942, but I'm ignorant of the larger structure of that year. And I think people write books for lots of different reasons. Some of them write them to get tenure, some of them write them to make money, some of them write them because they want to write a book. And those
all the above.
All the above. And those are all valid reasons. I write books to educate myself. I felt ignorant about 1942. And even though Shattered Sword kind of, went down in the weeds in terms of, stuff like damage control and what have you, I've always considered myself a big picture synthesist kind of guy. And I wanted to kind of spread my wings and get into some other theaters that I was not necessarily qualified to get into. And that's why I ended up talking about the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front and blah, blah, blah.
So we said decisive battle. I think the phrase that immediately comes to my mind when I think of 1942, people say it all the time, is turning point. Yeah. But I've never been particularly comfortable with the term. I gather that you're not particularly comfortable with the term, or else you would have called this 1942 turning point.
Right.
So, crux. Tell us about that.
I don't believe in turning points in terms of individual battles. I do believe in turning points in terms of the larger narrative of the war. Mm-hmm. And so if one of the things that I'm trying to do in the introduction to this book is lay out a series of questions that have to be answered by all of the major combatants, 3 or 4 of them per combatant. Mm-hmm. And cumulatively, I think that those lay out the larger answer to who is going to win this war and who is going to lose this war. So I do view 42 as the crux of the entire conflict. It is the hinge point around which the conflict revolves, because it's the first year that all the big dogs are in the game.
Right. Hitler certainly was conscious of that. He had to get something done at Stalingrad because the Americans were going to be in the game pretty soon. He knew that, wasn't quite sure when they were coming. Yeah. So can crux be the crossroads of the war? I'm thinking of the Latin root.
Yeah, I did not want to use the word decisive. I didn't want to use turning point. And the other thing I don't want to use is the untold story of, which has become, honest to God, the most trite, overused phrase in military history, I think. And I'm one of the leaders in that, right? Because that's what Shattered Sword was, the untold story of the blah, blah, blah.
Parenthetically, I wrote a book on Stalingrad, and I deliberately didn't say turning point. And when it got picked up by the History Channel, the little pamphlet came to my house and it said, Citino says turning point, 1942. So somehow other people will say it sometimes, even if you don't. The book, I will tell people who haven't purchased it yet, is unusually organized in that historians usually like to have a chat. It has an opening, there's maybe a little vignette, and then you make a 30-page argument, and then at the end there's some kind of nice tie-up. This book is organized chronologically and then thematically within the chronology.
Yep.
Talk to me about how you organized this book, because it is unusual.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the books that I was most influenced by was Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, it is.
And
Agree.
And he explores the war from a thematic standpoint. He's looking at economics, he's looking at leadership, he's looking at morale, he's looking at all sorts of stuff. And I just felt that this particular book couldn't be approached from a thematic standpoint strictly because Overy had already done it and probably done it better than I was going to be able to do it. The other thing was, too, that when I started writing this thing, I really thought about it as a battle history. I am a military historian. I like writing about battles. And so that suggested a chronological approach. And then the more I got into it, if you're going to drag a reader through 1,000 pages worth of manuscript, I think you have to have as much structure and as many navigational aids as you can possibly conjure up. So, that's why we got the pretty little tab edges and all that good stuff.
I mean, it looks like the Bible.
Yeah, or a dictionary, and it weighs about as much as one, too. So you can think of the book as a matrix in that, it's 13 monthly chronological chapters, but as you say, Eastern Front runs through the whole thing, Mediterranean, Pacific, blah, blah, blah. And each of those are little mini books inside the book. If you wanted to, you could pick it up, you could read Mediterranean end to end as its own standalone narrative. And that's how I wrote the book, too, in that I couldn't possibly have kept in my head all the things that happened in June. So I wrote Pacific end to end and put it up on a shelf for 13 years.
Oh, no kidding. You wrote the chapters in sections.
Yes.
And then assembled them.
It went track by track. That's right.
Oh, that's
and then
fascinating.
I pulled the Pacific back off the shelf after 10 years. I was like, God, there's way too many words in here. and went through and culled out about 25%, and it's still way too big. But anyway, that's kind of how it was assembled.
So you said 1942, you said that's when all the big dogs were finally in the war, when World War II becomes the war that we recognize. And you said that not one battle, but you could still see in a larger picture that 1942 is, if we may say, the turning point of the war. Why? What do you mean when you say the turning point of the war?
When we come into this year, the war is a dumpster fire for the Allies. It's going terribly for the Allies everywhere, right? And that does not really let up for the first, arguably, 8 months or so of the year. And yet, by the time we get to this 40-day time period that starts on October 23rd, when the Brits start doing their thing at Alamein. And then the locks are gonna click shut at Kalak behind Stalingrad on November 23rd. That rough 1 month period, I think, is the most catastrophic series of events for the Axis that happens during the entire war. How did that happen? Because it wasn't like the Russians just rolled out of bed one morning and said, we're not going to get our butts kicked by these guys anymore. It's not a question of morale or resolve. There's all of this stuff that's happening under the hood in terms of the rearmament of the Red Army, the remaking of the Red Army, doctrinal stuff, technological stuff, order of battle kind of stuff, yada, yada. And so you got to look under the hood to see how all of those things happened that creates this complete transformation of Allied military competence, I would argue, that leads to that catastrophe for the Axis.
We always talk about resources, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows the Allies outproduced the Axis many, many times over. But if every better armed army won every war, this would be a very different planet.
Yeah. Well, and it isn't, and the thing is, in 42, that's not the case. I mean, we're fighting at much more a level of parity with the Axis in 42. The productive spigots in America are not yet fully on are not going to be fully on really until the middle or end of 43, I would argue. So in 42, this is very much a come as you are kind of war. You know, we've got the Navy that we started with pretty much. We've got some...
minus Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, minus Pearl Harbor, yeah, there was a problem there. So I think this is, you know, the one opportunity really where the Axis could potentially have pushed one of the allies out of the war. There was still an opportunity to do that. And I'm interested in your opinion on that too, because, you know, I mention you specifically in this book, right?
Right.
One of the things I'm trying to do, bigger picture in this book, is push back on what I would call Eastern Front determinism, which is to say that depending, you know, on which scholar you are reading, summer or fall, the wheels fall off of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. 41. And at that point, a lot of scholars would make the argument that the Germans can no longer beat the Soviets, and therefore World War II is decided. And I find that ludicrous because the Americans and the Japanese are not even in the war at that point. But I feel very tentative about saying that in front of you or David Stahel or you know, David Glantz or you know, any of those people. How do you feel about that?
The tables are turned. The interviewer becomes the interviewee. I think this is a first at the National World War II Museum. I want you to all remember you were here.
You were here. Well, and let me drill in on the August chapter where we talk about the underlying meaning of Order Number 227. So in July of 1942, Stalin issues this Order Number 227, the famous not a step back order. And I would argue that Stalin is being pretty upfront with us, that he is scared and angry.
There's no subtext here? It's what you see is what you get?
I think if we view that as a primary source, you know, this is out of the horse's mouth. Uncle Joe is talking to us, and what he's saying is, I think most people look at that order as an order to put steel in the spine of the Red Army and tell those guys to fight harder. But the way he frames that order is almost completely in economic terms. He refers to the Soviet Union as it is not a desert. It is full of cities and people and farms and metal and factories. He uses the word bread no less than 7 times. I think that Stalin is telling us explicitly, the wheels are about to fall off here. You guys have got to do better out in the field, because if we lose a couple more big battles, people are no longer going to believe in victory. I think that Stalin does not repress for fun. Stalin represses when he is scared and angry. And so is that persuasive to you?
Since people are here to hear you talk, let me give a rapid answer to that. And I'd read all the work that said the war was over in 1941 when the wheels came off in front of Moscow and the Soviets launched a counterblow and destroyed about, you know, inflicted 1 million casualties on the Wehrmacht in a war that up till now they had suffered almost, you know, very, very minimal losses. But the 1942 campaign was as close a run thing as you could possibly imagine. The Germans were within a mile of the main military roads in the Caucasus that could have led them to Baku. They had already landed a hurt on the Soviets in the Crimea. They had landed another bigger on the Soviets at Kharkov. The beginning of Operation Blue, the Stalingrad campaign, was a complete disaster for the Soviets. It's easy to say they was a strategic pullback. It was partially that, but it was also partially a panicky retreat. They abandoned a fortified line they took a year to build.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I wrote 1942. You're getting asked, I'm asking you about Turning Point. I used to tell people back when I was writing that book, I'm writing a book on Stalingrad. People say, what is there to say about Stalingrad? Right. And I felt there was still quite a lot to say about Stalingrad. You can take all kinds of high-level reasoning, the big picture, the 20,000-foot view, however you want to put it. And at the end, it's a bunch of guys on the ground slugging it out. And how close the Germans came to victory in 1942 is still stunning to me.
Okay.
So
okay.
That's what I would say.
Okay. So
do you have a higher respect for me now?
No, I was genuinely interested in your reaction to that, because
I appreciate that, John. This is why most people don't care what I say about it.
No, I think the other underlying subtext there that Stalin is trying to bring out is that Okay, basically what we did last summer in 1941 is we traded away 40% of our population and 40% of our economy.
Can't do that again.
We cannot play that card again. You know, it's not available to us this summer, and so we have to hold it together. And so that is a big picture thing. What I'm trying to do in this book, I'm saying that the interpretational pendulum has swung too far towards Eastern Front determinism. I want to push back on that a little bit.
So Eastern Front determinism, the notion that the whole shebang was over in December 41 because the Germans didn't win quickly. That's what you mean by Eastern Front
That's
determinism.
what I mean. That's right.
That was a question I had, and you're partially answering it, but I wonder if we could get maybe a little more specific. I write books usually to argue something, but I also usually write books to argue against something and other people or other points of view in the field. So yours is Eastern Front determinism. You've already mentioned a few names. Do you think that is the state currently of Eastern Front scholarship that you have a view, people push back against it. It's called revisionism. It's what we do as historians.
It's an ugly little word, isn't it? Revisionism. Yes.
But has the revisionism gone too far? So we need to pull maybe the pendulum now in the other way.
Well, of course, I come from it being one of the I guess the older guard in the Pacific War cult, right? And Rich Frank is my good buddy, the grand poobah of the Pacific War historian mob, and a friend of the museum. Absolutely. And Rich and I have shared a number of beers, and some of the pushback on
that theme comes back.
It comes through, doesn't it? Although he's not really a cocktail guy. He's more of a beer guy.
Yeah, he is. Shot in a beer. No,
yeah.
Beer.
And anyway. And so what you're seeing there is I hope not pro-Pacific bias, but it's just a sense that the Pacific does not have nearly the size of armies deployed in it, obviously, and certainly from a strict body count standpoint, the blood lands in Russia, Poland, and East Germany is where the majority of the dying occurs. However, China was no piker in that regard. 15 to 22 million people in China lost their lives in the course of this war. Millions more in Indonesia and Vietnam, surprisingly, also in the Philippines. And I would argue, too, that even though there are a smaller number of divisions in play in the Asia-Pacific War, they are playing for proportionately larger marbles. They affect the lives of many more people per division, I would say. The Japanese Empire is the size of the British Empire in terms of population. It's 500 million people. It's far more people than Hitler will ever have.
400 million of whom they conquer. I mean, they have a population of roughly
Bingo.
80.
You got it. So again, that handful of divisions is affecting the lives of lots and lots and lots of people.
So you can't accept a vision of World War II that says the whole thing was decided before the war in the Pacific even got underway.
I will not.
You will not.
I will not.
That's your line in the water. I was the line in the sand. Your line in the water.
And so another thing that this book is trying to do is bring the importance of China in the early part of the conflict more to the fore. Yeah. They become less important as the war goes on, but in 42 they're incredibly important because of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union is on the ropes, and the last thing that Stalin needs is for the Japanese to get chippy and decide that they want to launch a war out of Manchuria and into Siberia. I mean, the Soviets do not need a two-front war at this point. And so keeping China involved in the combat to act as a manpower sump for the 1.5 million Japanese troops that are in Manchuria and China is critically important. And both FDR and Churchill recognize that. So they are doing everything they can to keep the Chinese on their feet. In fact, one of the things that goes down in the middle of the year, as you're well aware, Marshall goes over to London in July of 1942 to make a last gasp effort to try to get the Brits to agree to a cross-channel invasion as soon as possible. And the British want nothing to do with that, and rightly. And Marshall and King end up conceding defeat. They come back to DC. They have to reorient our whole strategy towards, okay, we're going into North Africa. That's what we're going to do this year. But one of the things that ends up coming out of that is that there's this memorandum that King gets a hold of that basically says, okay, those 800 tactical airplanes that we were going to be using to support this invasion, we don't need those anymore. You can take them over to the Pacific. That reorients our grand strategy from Germany first to, I would argue, Germany mostly first.
Yes.
And Marshall sort of comes to peace with that because he's like, okay, well, if King and Nimitz are keeping the Japanese busy down in the Solomon Islands, that's going to make enough trouble for them that likewise they hopefully will not want to get chippy against the Soviets. So the war is interconnected. That's what I'm trying to point out here.
I taught at the faculty seminar here on campus this morning, and we quoted the great Gerhard Weinberg in a number of contexts, and one of the dean of U.S. military historians of World War II. As Gerhard has many times told me, you have to remember, Rob, the earth is round. So what happens in one part of World War II almost automatically impacts all the others in ways sometimes that you can't even suspect. They continue to surprise me, the interconnectedness of events in World War II. Let me pin you down a little bit, John.
Okay, turn the tables again. Okay, yes, do it.
Let me take control of this interview again.
Yes.
So in 1942, we have Stalingrad, we have El Alamein, and we have Operation Torch. The Allies are on the march. We have Midway, and we have Guadalcanal. What is the most important of those five? Can you prioritize one over the others? Or?
Nope.
Well, let's move on then. Again, because of the interconnectedness issue?
Yeah. I would say that their importance depends on which observer you would want to talk to. I mean, if I were to go and tell Richard Overy that Guadalcanal were more important than Alamein, he would start slapping me with a fish or something like that, right? I think that if you look at Alamein with respect to the British, it's incredibly important. Winston Churchill is a wounded animal at this point in time. He desperately needs a political victory.
There's been votes of confidence?
Yeah, votes of no confidence in July of that year. The British have got to demonstrate that they are an important and vital portion of this coalition before their contributions begin to be overshadowed by the Americans. Mm-hmm. And so I think for, just domestic consumption reasons, if nothing else, it is absolutely critical that Alamein be a British victory.
How about Guadalcanal? How about Guadalcanal for the Americans? Is it the same sort of thing? I mean, there had been Midway, this bolt out of the blue at Midway.
Yeah.
Guadalcanal, and that was an afternoon, a couple of hours.
Right.
Guadalcanal is month after month of grinding jungle combat.
Guadalcanal is the most important campaign in the whole of the Asia-Pacific War. Period.
There you go. All right.
There you go. I mean, you can make the argument that the Marianas Campaign is perhaps more important to the overall conduct of the war just because it sets up bomber bases that are going to end that war. But coming into the Guadalcanal campaign, it is by no means clear that the Americans can field military forces of sufficient quality on the ground to beat the Japanese. Mm-hmm. The Japanese have just run roughshod over all of the Allied armies out in the Asia-Pacific up to that point. And we should toss in a word here for the Australians at Milne Bay in New Guinea, which happens like 10 days after the Battle of Alligator Creek in August of 1942. The Australians beat a Japanese force at the tip of New Guinea, and they too demonstrate that a combination of stout infantry and really good artillery are sort of the magic elixir that will allow you to finally beat the Japanese
The
army.
Australians have been handled very roughly by the Japanese in their earlier encounters. Been sort of driven from one coast of New Guinea to the other, correct?
Yeah.
My father was on Guadalcanal, and I always like to take experts with the Army, not a Marine.
Okay.
The Marines took the island, but my father claims they were unable to hold it until he showed up.
Don't let McManus hear you saying that. I mean, the Army had a lot of things to do in that battle,
I could go on for
anyway. Go on.
I could talk about my father on Guadalcanal a long time. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a specific question, John. You're a slippery character, but I'm doing my best to pin you down in front of all these people. The Stalingrad campaign.
Yeah.
Could the Germans? What is the point at which the Germans could have won it? Let me quote you on page 568.
He comes out with the
Crux
quote.
of War. You call the German army of 1942, a more dented version of the all-conquering Titan that had thrown down Barbarossa's armored gauntlet a bit less than a year before, which is giving you a good flavor of Parshallian prose, by the way. The entire book reads like that. Was that dented army strong enough? Stalingrad wasn't the issue, of course. It was supposed to get across the Caucasus and conquer the oil fields all the way to Baku, which is, if you're counting, today is in Azerbaijan. It's a long, long way from Berlin. Was there a possibility that campaign could have gone differently?
Yes. I think it was unlikely that it was going, and I will quote my friend Rob Citino, who says that, given the extended flanks that the Germans had created for themselves along the Don River in the course of their advance to Stalingrad, that something bad is likely to happen on those flanks someplace.
Did I say that? It sounds like something.
Yeah,
I'd say.
it was, out of Death of the Wehrmacht, I think I quote you. I think if there was going to be a Soviet collapse, I don't know that it was going to be strictly military. I think that the weak point of the Soviets in this year really is economic. And that's another one of my sort of, I don't want to say pet peeves, but I think when Eastern Front determinists look at the war, they tend to analyze it primarily along military lines, and they neglect the economic.
So space. How many square miles? How many prisoners the Germans are taking? Those kinds of things.
I think it's more along how many calories are going into Soviet stomachs. One of the arguments I make in this book is that it doesn't necessarily take a revolution to overthrow Stalin or to end this war. If the factory workers decide that they no longer believe in military victory, and they decide that today potatoes is more important than production, I'm not going to the factory today, screw it. If that goes on for a couple of months, if the Soviet people stop believing and start, looking out for themselves and not going to the factories, it's over. The munitions supply ceases to the front and the Germans kick in the door and it's done. That's what I think. So I would view it as being a multi-axial collapse, that there would a couple of bad military defeats, maybe a Stalingrad. If they take Stalingrad, given the amount of emotional energy that has been vested in holding this piece of real estate, the Germans take that, and you have an economic hiccup as a result of that, the wheels could come off. And again, I think the circumstantial evidence from the Soviet side suggests that the wheels were very close to coming off.
The Russians had done this before in World War I. They sort of walked away. The factory workers stayed home and the soldiers walked away. Lenin famously said, the workers have voted for Bolshevism. And someone said, we didn't have an election. And he said they voted with their feet. That was where we get that famous
You got it.
And
of course, that whole voting with their feet thing is exactly what we've seen in the Soviet soldiery during July, during the retreat through Donbass. You described this, strategic retreat. The other aspect of what's going on there is there were a lot of those soldiers who had seen what had happened in the summer of '41. They knew that they were about to get surrounded by these German armored pincers, and they're like, peace, we're out.
Peace out. They skedaddled.
They sidestepped,
That's interesting talk. Reformulating the 42 campaign in the Soviet Union from the economic perspective leads to a different view of it completely. Midway, John, you are the man on Midway. Everybody knows that. If you haven't read John's earlier book on Midway, you should all run out and buy multiple copies right now.
And it's only half as long as this thing.
You can carry it without injuring yourself, so there's an
That's
advantage. I promise you, I wouldn't.
No
more jokes about how big this book is.
I mock the book's size because it is very mockable. I mean, this could be part of your step aerobics program. I mean, you can do many things with this book. So, go for it, man.
Page 74. I'll quote you again.
74.
You write about the Battle of Midway and say neither Enterprise nor Yorktown's aircraft were aware of each other. And they're finding Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier fleet, simultaneously was pure luck. You're the man on this topic, John. There's no one else I would talk to on Midway that I know who has the depth of your knowledge. How much luck was involved in the U.S. victory at Midway?
A lot. A lot. I will say that the fact that we had more scouting assets available to us at Midway than the Japanese, right? And that's something that's often overlooked in the study of Midway, is that carrier warfare, at least at this point in the war, was very much he who attacks effectively first is going to probably win the battle. And that means that I need to detect the enemy force first. And so the fact that we had 20-odd PBY Catalinas on Midway itself that were out looking for the Japanese, and they only had 7 planes out looking for us, a couple of which didn't do their job, means that the odds were we were going to detect them first and we were going to attack first. The really lucky part, though, ends up the fact that both Enterprises Air Group and Yorktown's Air Group detect Kidobutai at roughly the same time, and they are approaching from 2 different vectors, which means that suddenly this Japanese carrier force, in the days before radar, without any sort of centrally coordinated fighter defenses, is now presented with a multi-vector, multi-altitude threat, which would have been difficult for us to deal with even in like 1944 with, radar and combat information centers and the whole schmear. The Japanese are being given the same problem in 1942 without any of those assets, and what ends up happening is, their cap arrangements just collapse.
You say multi-altitude, so there's low-level torpedo bombers, and they bring the Japanese fighters down, and then there's high-level
and
bombers?
that's a bit of a myth too. So the first planes they detect are Yorktown's torpedo planes, which are actually coming in at like medium altitude, about 8,000 feet. Oh. And so what ends up happening is a group of Japanese combat air patrol fighters, they kind of, planes over there, let's go that way. And then the other groups, are also seeing, hey, they're going that way, maybe we should go that way too. And so all of the Japanese fighters get kind of sucked into this southeast threat vector where the torpedo planes are coming through.
So it's not altitude, it's directional.
That's correct. Okay. That is correct. We have just debunked a Midway myth.
There we go. And you're the man for doing that.
Yep.
As you wrote this book, did you go back and look at Shattered Sword, and were you able to reconsider anything you said in that book? Have your views on Midway changed substantially in the last 15 years?
I feel like Shattered Sword has actually held up relatively well.
I would say so too.
I think the core arguments that Tony and I made in that book are still sound. There are aspects of it that if I could do over, I would. I know less about what was going on in the Japanese hangars during the rearming debacle than I thought I knew when I wrote that book.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. There are little things. Tony and I have continued to publish articles in like the Naval War College Review.
And you've been part of this this ongoing conversation.
Yeah. And so honestly, one of the things I kind of want to do maybe after this is now out in the world is I'd like to go back and strong-arm Nebraska Press and see if we could do an updated version of
So Nebraska currently owns the rights to Shattered Sword?
Yes, they do, which I appreciate because Potomac Books didn't necessarily pay the royalties on time. So thank you, Nebraska, if you're out there.
Hope the cameras are catching this.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
In a similar vein, Guadalcanal. Was there a real danger of U.S. forces losing the Battle of Guadalcanal?
Absolutely.
And can you identify what moments of the Battle of Guadalcanal that would have been true, or are they legion? There are too many.
I think the danger points for Guadalcanal start, honestly, they start from the Battle of Savo Island, which is like August 8th.
So a couple days after they landed?
Yeah, I mean, it's bad from there on. It's really bad in October. And it gets really, really hairy again during the first and second naval battles of Guadalcanal, which are in November, November 13th, 14th, and then again on the 15th. So the Japanese are sending down battleships, to put Henderson Field out of business. And the first group of ships that we, throw in there to fight them don't have any guns larger than 8-inch rifles, and it, turns into this famous brawl that actually my cohort in crime, Seth, is writing a book about in the back there.
Seth Paradine, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, my cohort in crime. And we,
Please.
Unauthorized, yes.
A great American.
Yeah, that's right. And we, by hook or by crook, managed to turn that particular bombardment force back around. And I hate to say it, but that was to an extent through the stupidity of the Japanese, because instead of bringing down 2 battleships, they could have brought down 4. They could have brought down 6, honestly. And 2 nights after that, the follow-up battle, when we have 2 fast battleships, the Washington and the South Dakota under Willis Lee, who's going to be fighting against the Kirishima and another Japanese surface force. Again, the Japanese could have brought down 3 battleships if they had wanted to. how are we going to beat 3 or 4 or 5 battleships? But this speaks to a central problem for the Japanese, which is, on our side, after the middle of October, we've got William Halsey is now the theater commander. And Halsey, he was, I would say by 1944, the war has passed him by. But in 42, he was absolutely the right dude at the right time in the right place. He was pugilistic, and he is absolutely determined to fight for this island down to the last bloody rowboat, if that's what it takes. Right. And so on the night of the 15th, he has shoved the last 2 fast battleships that he has in theater. I mean, it literally, that decision to send these 2 battleships into the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound, where we have just been beaten and beaten and beaten over and over, and we know the Japanese torpedoes are really good at this point. I mean, it's just a hair-raising decision. But he is willing to push all of his chips into the middle of the table. The Japanese give a lip service to that. They're like, okay, this is the decisive battle. Well, okay, dudes, but if it is, then why aren't you willing to push in all the battleships? Prove it. Yeah. Come on down and do this thing. And they do not do that. So
the waters in the Solomon Islands are Iron Bottom Sound for a reason, because of the large number of ships who have been sunk there. You're risking essentially the rest of your fleet in very narrow waters. I mean, no modern Navy wants to do. You don't want land on both sides of you. You want to be in the blue water.
It is the nautical equivalent of a cage match. Yeah. There's only 3 ways in and out of that sound, and they're very narrow. So yeah, if Willis Lee gets into trouble with those battleships there, man, there's no way to get out. You're in deep weeds.
There's a moment at which FDR calls up the Joint Chiefs and says, I just want to make sure that every last man and ship and gun and plane or whatever is being devoted to this battle at Guadalcanal.
Yep.
What does that mean when the commander-in-chief calls? We got to call on, someone's on the line. Who? The president.
Yeah. And that demonstrates a central point, that if you go back and you look at the newspaper headlines from September on in the New York Times, the 2 battles that you're going to see getting the most real estate devoted to are Guadalcanal and Stalingrad. Mm-hmm. Everybody is very, very concerned about how these battles are going. And this too illustrates sort of another central point, that battles take on lives of their own.
They certainly do. Yeah.
And at a certain point, the fact that you're fighting over this malarial hellhole, its intrinsic value is nil. Its emotional value is inestimable. We have to hold on to this place just to demonstrate that we have the moral ascendancy over the Japanese. And the same thing is true in Stalingrad. I mean, Stalin, his name is on the box, right? This is his namesake city. He has to keep it.
Here's what I've seen as a myth of Stalingrad. I'll run this one by you. I know the German documents pretty well, and I never saw a single document that we got to take Stalingrad because it's named after Stalin. But I've seen documents from the Soviet side that say so. We have to hold the city because it's named after Stalin. So I don't think it's Hitler's obsession as much as it is Stalin's.
That's interesting, because I say this in the book, and maybe I'm wrong, but I view Hitler as primarily a political animal, and I think he understands the symbolic value of that city in his bones. Maybe he didn't articulate it, but that's poor, sloppy historiography on my part.
Oh, I wouldn't necessarily say when you're discussing Hitler, you're not really in the rational actor model anyway. True. He doesn't lend himself to the kind of rationality. He's said different things to different people constantly, and that's also the dictator's prerogative. Right. He can say anything he wants to anybody. But it's fascinating, your notion of the invested battle. We've invested, and the investment has, of course, been the blood of hundreds of thousands of our soldiers, and we've had headlines, and we've had appeals to the soldiers not to retreat. And suddenly, Stalingrad's, it's a big city, and it's an important city, it has production. It's not as big as Kharkov, and the Soviets have lost Kharkov repeatedly. Yeah. And I think 4 or 5 times when it was all said and done, how many times Kharkov changed hands.
I think the geography of Stalingrad, and this is something that always stuck with me from your book as well, that Stalingrad, because of its nature, is this sort of long fortified strip along the river. It's really not a circular city that we're sort of familiar with.
Yeah, it's 20 miles long. It's 20 miles long.
Yeah, and that just by the nature of the fact that it is so long and Anyway,
it's a huge fortified line.
Yeah.
Stalingrad falls, the entire Volga has been denuded of
Right.
any possibility of defense. I think we might be getting towards the end of our time together.
All
We're
right.
going to turn you over to the tender mercies of our audience. Which
Awesome.
is always hair-raising here at the National World War II Museum.
Excellent.
Let me ask you one last question, John. Please don't laugh. 1,280 pages. But I'm wondering if you feel that you had to leave anything out. Let's say Oxford University Press said, John, give us another 100. Is there a topic where you wish you could have done a little bit of a deeper dive? Any good material wind up on the cutting room floor, as all filmmakers say?
First, I need to say in Oxford's defense that they were incredibly good to work with.
I'm certain they were.
Yeah.
They allowed this.
They allowed this monstrosity to be created. And no, they never quibbled with me over word count or page count or any of that stuff. I mean, Timothy Bent, who is my editor, he just basically was like, you go do you know. And so I laid this whole thing out, and I'm just off in the wilderness doing that. No. I don't need another 100 pages, but I realize there are certain things that I did I don't want to say overlook, but bypassed, like the WWII conference. There's nothing in there on the WWII conference, and Alexandra Ritchie would absolutely excoriate me for that.
So this is the conference where we say the Germans, so to say, planned the Holocaust, the Wannsee conference outside of Berlin. So the book doesn't deal so much with the sort of racial side of World War II as so many books do today.
That's right. And if you had to point out a weak point, I am not a Holocaust historian. I know enough to be dangerous, but those were waters that I did not want to really get into. I do talk about the economic aspects of that Adam Tooze and Wages of Destruction kind of gets into. So I definitely brought that aspect into it, but I'm not going to go down into the weeds.
I think the notion that every historian has to write everything is kind of a bogus notion anyway. It's really not how history is done. I'm comfortable in certain topics, and I'll write those to death, and then other topics I say I might leave those to the experts.
Yeah.
John Parshall, ladies and gentlemen, the author of 1942, Crux of War.
Thank you.
Fantastic. You can catch John, and you can catch me, and you can catch a lot of our friends. Bradley Hart is in the room somewhere on the World War II with Tom Hanks special. John,
yes.
You rocked the Midway episode.
Thank you.
In ways that, even though I know you very well, I was watching it and I was shouting high five and hoisting a libation in your general direction.
Appreciate that.
I saw you on screen. Yeah. Now we will, as I say, turn you over to the audience. I see Jeremy Collins in the background, and people raise their hands. Jeremy or someone will come to you and give you the microphone.
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating that the Soviets were able to rebuild their army, and what I don't understand is how they were able to do it after Stalin foolishly had a lot of the generals murdered.
Great question.
Good question, yeah.
And actually, okay, two-part answer to that. One has to do with the military, the other has to do with Stalin. To Stalin's credit, as soon as Barbarossa starts in July of 1941, the Stavka immediately recognizes, within just the first few weeks, that we are not nearly as good at the Germans as the Germans are at war making. And they begin putting in place a whole series of military reforms. They are reorganizing the army. They tear apart their org chart not once but twice in the course of 15 months. And they're pulling artillery out of the rifle divisions because they recognize the rifle division commanders don't know what the hell they're doing, and so they're pulling the RD tubes out to try to preserve those and put them under specialized commanders, yada yada yada. So they do a lot of things, as I say, under the hood, and Stalin is actually one of the motivators for that. He's trying to push that process forward. The second part to that answer, though, really has to do with the evolution of Stalin as a wartime leader. And yeah, he is directly responsible for a number of the catastrophes on the western frontier of the Soviet Union, and his mishandling and bungling of that war, which cost millions of Soviet lives, continues, I would argue, all the way up to Kharkov. I look at Kharkov as kind of
So May of 1942.
May of 1942. That disaster, which was under the leadership of Timoshenko, who was one of his right-hand guys, I feel like that's the wake-up call for him that, okay, I've got to be a little more hands-off here and let professionals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who's the chief of the Red Army staff at this point, I got to let those guys do what they do. And by the time, fast forward to Stalingrad, he is now comfortable enough, he's relaxed the reins sufficiently that he's willing to give Zhukov and Vasilevsky the lead and say, launch this attack whenever you feel comfortable in doing so. And so, and the interesting sort of counterpoint to that is what is happening with Hitler during the same time frame, that Hitler is continuing to fire generals and is drawing more and more of the operational reins into his own hands and is doing it very badly. So it was absolutely essential that Stalin get better in order for the Soviets to do better in this war.
Hitler famously, this little thing called operations, anyone can handle it.
Right.
He famously said, and found out that he couldn't. 1942 campaign, Hitler had a real hand in. So that it's that contrary character arc between Stalin and Hitler that is fascinating.
Hey.
I was thinking about my parents in 1942 and wondering about domestically. Can you share with us, this was Pearl Harbor, such a big, huge shock, and the whole aspect of 1942 about recovering and mobilizing and, the anxieties and so on going on during that period. It must have been a huge transition. And
absolutely.
I'm interested in your thoughts about domestically what we were being called to do.
Yeah. And that's a couple of points that I would make there. One of the things that I hammer on in the introduction to the book is it sure wasn't obvious at the time that I feel like we, with the luxury of 80 years removed from this conflict, we understand how it turns out, and we're sitting in our comfy chairs and oh, it couldn't have been that big a crisis, right? Oh my God. If you read the contemporary accounts, people were very, very concerned about how this war was going to come out. I mean, if you asked any average man or woman on the street, how do you think this war is going to end? And you asked them that in January or February of 42, oh my God, it doesn't look good at all. We have contemporary accounts from people like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who says that no one can understand the fears and worries that we had at that time. So, there was by no means a sense of complacency about how this war was going to turn out. It was a dumpster fire. The question around transformation, I do think we had this popular notion that, we just turned on a dime and we completely mobilized and completely rearmed and, did all of that. A lot of those pumps had already been primed because of Lend-Lease contracts to the British. So a lot of our war-related industry was already starting to kind of come up to speed. But during the course of 42, and I do talk about this, there is a thematic track within this book. I call it the economic grand strategy track. It's really the catch-all. And so I do talk about economic issues, and I do talk about wartime mobilization. Labor, there's an enormous migration of Americans during this time. It's one of the biggest migrations, it's the biggest migration in this country's history. 25 million people are going to up stakes during the course of this war. And as David Kennedy described it, is as if the country had been tilted to the north and the west. Right. So there's this huge migration of workers out of the South to either the Midwest regions, which is all centered on the railroad companies and the auto industry, or out to California for the aircraft factories and the shipyards that are out there. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of scrambling that I talk about during the course of this year, where we're trying to, we're throwing tons of money at things, but we still got to figure out where are we going to get the workers. And of course, these people show up out in California. There's no place to live. There's a lot of that going on.
Thank you. My question is basically tied to Stalingrad, and it also is tied to the fact that if Hitler wasn't as involved, could the German strategy of being able to stop short of the city, create defensive lines in the hills, the mountains short of the city, then thin out the line to be able to free up possibly one Panzer Corps and one infantry corps to be added to the drive to the Caucasus. I realized logistics was so iffy that might have been the most they could probably shift down without leaving that line undone. And I guess that's the question, rather than doing the city fighting.
Yeah, we can go round and round
Yeah,
on this.
why don't you go, John? It's a good question.
Yeah, but Hitler basically, he bifurcated his offensive. He sent, one group towards Stalingrad, the other group towards the Caucasus. And the argument would be, I think you've got to do one or the other. I am an old school Operation Blau guy that I think it should have followed that plan. I think you go pell-mell for Stalingrad first, you take it, and then you advance down the line of the river there to Astrakhan, and you head for Baku. That, I think, is their best bet for success. And I will push back to, Anthony Beever's book on Stalingrad talks about the fact that he should have disengaged 16th and 24th Panzer divisions in the city and pulled them back as a strategic reserve. I think that's nonsense because they were embedded in the city fighting. And Hitler is micromanaging this conflict down to, in some cases, the company level. There's no way you're going to be able to pull the wool over this guy's eyes and oh yeah, by the way, I pulled out the 2 remaining Panzer divisions here, which are barely the strength of reinforced battalions at this point, and I took them someplace else. That's just not going to work. But anyway, what do you think?
If I would just add
Please.
briefly, I think Stalingrad is the Stalingrad campaign, the campaign in the Southern Soviet Union, is a fascinating campaign. If you just take Stalingrad, but you don't get to the Caucasus, then you haven't won the campaign. The campaign was intended to wind up with you, the Germans, in possession of most of the world's oil reserves. So Stalingrad doesn't really help. If you go for the Caucasus without Stalingrad, you got a gigantic Soviet city and potentially Soviet reinforcements on your deep flank, actually 500 miles in your rear. So you had to do it sequentially. Hitler got impatient in the middle, and you may notice that we'll just go for both simultaneously, which is, Hitler is a study in bad decisions, believe me. But this might have been the worst of all. But again, you win Stalingrad, yes, you may cause a collapse in the Soviet Union. That's true.
Right.
And we have to consider that. It's possible. But it's also possible it wouldn't happen. And then you haven't really won anything. You don't have the oil. The whole campaign was meant to secure these huge oil reserves. At the time, Baku, I think, had the second or the third largest oil reserves.
A lot of oil, yeah, for sure.
When planning the Guadalcanal operation, it was realized that it was in MacArthur's area of operations. So they moved it over 1 degree west. If MacArthur had operational control, his inclination was to invade Rabaul directly.
Right.
Barring that, had he been in charge of the Guadalcanal operation and the Solomons, how do you think that would have turned out?
There you go, John. Wow.
Seth is snickering at
This
me.
is a tough group. It is.
Yeah, it
This
is.
a tough group.
Wow. Can you put that into the Q&A questions to unauthorized next? I don't know. I will tell you that I don't think that MacArthur is as emotionally well equipped to command a desperately tenuous defense in the same way that Halsey was.
Oh, it's interesting.
So I think I would say if I were a betting man that I don't think our odds I don't know that would MacArthur have shoved those 2 fast battleships into that fight, for instance, on November 15th, and I think my gut is to say no, I don't think he would have.
MacArthur was already the defeated of Bataan, and now putting him in a desperate defensive situation on Guadalcanal.
Well, and he already had his own desperate defensive situation or offensive situation, really. He's dealing with Bunagona at the same time, and he's completely botching that fight, too.
Not a fan?
There's nuance there, too.
Oh, they have good, John.
There's nuance. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of MacArthur. I have tremendous respect for his actions as Supreme Commander during the occupation. He saved the Japanese from starvation, and I think he gave them an incredibly enlightened constitution. But in the 13 months that I am dealing with in this book, his generalship was just absolutely execratious. It was terrible. And if he were anything other than what he was, which was incredibly senior and, you know, weighed down with political dynamite, he would have been cashiered, you know.
13 months, so this book is, December
Yes.
41.
December 41 to
All the
December
way through
42 inclusive, that's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rob Citino and John Parshall, 1942 Crux of War.